Meta, which of course is the parent company of Facebook, is threatening to block all news content from its platform should legislation that was introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar pass through the so-called Defense Authorization Act. It's legislation that she's tacking onto what's referred to as a must-pass bill, which always passes with no problem in Congress. Now, the bill in question is known as the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which sounds real good, okay? Also known as the JCPA. Now, what is the legislation and why are groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU against it? Let me give you the details first, and then I'll discuss. Now, the legislation introduced by Senator Klobuchar and backed by more than a dozen other lawmakers from both parties would create a 4-year exemption under US antitrust law. Already that doesn't sound good. Allowing news outlets to bargain collectively against social media platforms for a larger share of ad revenue in exchange for their news content. It is one of several tech-focused antitrust bills currently pending on Capitol Hill. So understand what's happening here, okay? It is essentially a piece of legislation that makes an exemption for media companies seeking to join together to fight for a larger share of revenue from these platforms, including Facebook. Now, on its face, that doesn't sound like such a bad idea, except it's literally saying, well, in this case, media monopoly is okay. Now, more on that in just a minute, but let me give you some more detail on the legislation on its face and how Meta has responded to it. Now, Andy Stone, who's a spokesperson for Meta, says, if Congress passes an ill-considered journalism bill as part of national security legislation, we will be forced to consider removing news from our platform altogether rather than submit to government-mandated negotiations that unfairly disregard any value we provide to news outlets through increased traffic and subscriptions. The Journalism Competition and Preservation Act fails to recognize the key fact. Publishers and broadcasters put their content on our platform themselves because it benefits their bottom line, not the other way around. That part I disagree with. They definitely benefit from it as well. I mean, we're talking about ad revenue. They take a piece of that ad revenue, don't they?
Facebook does,
Yeah.
certainly, yes.
Yeah, so
they would want to drive up ad revenue as much as possible. How they share it with news outlets is a different question.
Yes.
Again, there's another story I have strong opinions on, but
yes.
keep going.
So let me give you all the details though, because again, this is one of those stories. It's a piece of legislation that uses the right language, right? Collective bargaining. That sounds real good. You want collective bargaining. It pretends to look out for the little guy, meaning independent media or local news outlets, but it completely ignores the fact, by the way, that much of the media today, especially local news, falls under giant corporate conglomerates, okay? Yes. Totally ignores that. So in reality, what's happening behind the scenes with this legislation is trying to give powerful news organizations and media conglomerates a leg up when it comes to advertising dollars on these platforms. More on this. So the strategy to get this passed was a pretty smart one. As I mentioned earlier, they're planning on tacking it onto a bill that usually passes with no problem whatsoever. Fight for the Future, a digital rights organization, told reporters that multiple sources had said a push to include the JCPA in the annual defense bill was successful and that the National Defense Authorization Act included the JCPA's language. Now, let me understand this. If this is such a wonderful bipartisan piece of legislation that's really protecting journalism and free speech in America, freedom of the press in America, why do they need to attach it to the National Defense Authorization Act? So that's a red flag in and of itself.
100%.
Okay, but I got more, Cenk. You gotta let me explain it in full because it's so easy to get tricked by this bill. The bill has also attracted criticism from more than 24 civil society groups that are often at odds with big tech on policy matters. In a letter Monday to congressional leaders, those groups said the JCPA could make mis and disinformation worse by allowing news websites to sue tech platforms for reducing a story's reach and intimidating them into not moderating offensive or misleading content. And by the way, those groups include the ACLU, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Wikimedia Foundation, and also Public Knowledge. And in a letter, the letter also said the JCPA could end up disproportionately favoring large media companies over the small, local, and independent outlets that have been hit by the hardest, or that have been hit the hardest by falling digital ad revenues. So I'm gonna give you some statements from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I think they did a great job explaining why they're against this piece of legislation. Before I do though, Cenk, tell me why you have such strong opinions against it.
Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna state our bias as a company. We've got bias on both ends. We actually will probably fall into the category of the news companies that could form a conglomeration. But we also make a good amount of our revenue from Facebook. So that means that we don't want news to be taken off of Facebook. We're biased in both directions. We're always open and transparent about how we report that. Okay, now, here's my real opinions. So number one, I just have a philosophical problem with this, and you could even call it a conservative position economically.
The price fixing?
Yeah, you can't. This is the government's supposed to protect you guys, okay? So if a government intervenes with a company and say, hey, you can do this and you cannot do this, you can't pollute, you can't price gouge, etc. That's one thing, and what its main job is, right? When it gets between two companies, well, all it's doing is political capture. Whichever set of companies gave more money to the politicians have the advantage. And in this case, by the way, the number one set of companies that help determine who wins political office are local news companies. Those are the ones that run not just the ads, but the news stories that make the biggest difference in their election and re-election campaigns. So here they're saying, no, we're gonna let one set of companies set the price or help to set the price for another company completely. Why? Why are you guys getting involved? If those companies don't want to do a deal with Facebook because Facebook didn't set the right rates, then they don't do a deal. That's called life in the big city. They go find a different platform. They form their own platform. They do whatever. But saying, hey, I don't like the price you're giving me. I'm gonna get the government to get me a higher price. It doesn't make any sense at all, right? And then and then there was something weird about this where it was like the New York Times, Washington Post, etc. weren't fully behind it though. I could sense it. It was like, I'm like, why didn't they talk about this over and over again? Normally, they love beating up on digital media. So buyer beware, whenever you see a story about digital media and its horrors, sometimes it's absolutely true, but a lot of times it's bigger media, old traditional media going, digital media, they're so dangerous, they're terrible, we're awesome, right? But in this case, the reason why New York Times and CNN aren't howling is it excludes bigger companies.
Well, yeah, so that's an important point to touch on, okay? So the original language of the legislation, as Amy Klobuchar put it forward, did not have restrictions in regard to the size of the media company. So there was some backlash in that regard because you don't want this to turn into legislation that actually crushes smaller media outlets that don't have the kind of resources giant legacy like corporate owned media tends to have. And so this is hilarious because Klobuchar's like, okay, don't worry. We're gonna add an amendment, okay? And the amendment is going to exempt companies that employ more than 1,500 people. I mean, Cenk, so like, listen, that's a lot of employees, right? Local news doesn't even employ like 300 people. Let's just keep it real.
Oh yeah. No.
So like my point is that restriction isn't really much of a restriction in my opinion. And if you look at, I did some digging to see what are other big media conglomerates saying. And one of the big media conglomerates online actually is Vox Media. Vox Media owns all sorts of publications and stuff that you're probably reading, like SB Nation, New York Magazine, The Dodo, now this, it's all under Vox Media. Vox Media is like, I jump in it, they love it.
Yeah,
right?
Because they're in our camp. They're in the camp of companies that would get to use this as leverage against Facebook.
Right.
So whereas the New York Times is not in that camp, so the New York Times is muted, whereas Vox is like, this is the most important bill. I mean, you see the editorial screaming through, whereas we're telling you, even though we would be positively affected, it appears, we're not in favor of the bill because it's not, I don't think it's a good bill.
Well, there are other issues as well pertaining to copyright violations, right? So I'm gonna get to those details in a minute. And actually, I think the Frontier Foundation, Electronic Frontier Foundation, did a great job explaining what they meant here and why the copyright issues involved would be disastrous for media. So they write, competition doesn't flourish when a group, even one of smaller newsrooms, is allowed to form a cartel. It just means that both sides of this fight are now huge. Proposed changes to the bill will limit the organizations that could get compensation under this scheme to publications with 1,500 employees or fewer. But, as they write in their explanation for why they're against this, that won't preserve competition because the loss of local and independent news has already happened. Many smaller publications are now owned or backed by large corporations and venture capital funds.
Of course.
The venture capital funds are the ones lobbying for this bill. I guarantee it.
100%.
I guarantee it. Okay, let me give you more though. And the industry is consolidating at a rapid rate. The large corporations and investment vehicles that dominate online journalism took advantage of the mess created by Facebook and Google's ad domination. And the JCPA would allow them to reap the rewards of buying up, laying off, and clickbaiting these newsrooms. And by the way, the other thing is, if let's say you're a giant media organization and you've gone a little over that 1,500 employee, threshold, I mean, this kind of gives you a little bit of a incentive to fire some folks, right?
Or more likely what they'll do, especially if they're a digital media company, is they'll spin off one part of their company.
They'll find a way.
Yeah, of course, it's so easy to get around these things.
And then finally, it's equally untenable, they write, to restrict who can link to publicly available pages on the web. So understand that based on the language of the legislation, if you're sharing news stories on your feed on Facebook, you could be slapped with copyright for doing so, right? So there's that issue, and it is a mess. The way that it's written, the way that this would be carried out, if it passes, is a mess. That has grave consequences for the entire internet, which depends on the ability to link to information sources from far and wide. Linking isn't copyright infringement, at least under current law. But the JCPA risks creating a new quasi-copyright law for linking, or even leading the courts to extend copyright law to cover some forms of linking.
Yeah, no, it's if they apply it, it's going to be an absolute disaster. And then you won't get any news online because companies are not going to be like, oh yeah, why don't you just why don't I let my customers set the price for, and then I have to pay it no matter what, and it's going to come with 1,000 legal hassles that's going to cost me millions, if not hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. They're just not going to do it, and then you're not going to get the news at all. Now, if you're wondering, wait a minute, why is this bipartisan? This has an excellent chance of passing, unfortunately. I'm not sure it's going to because there's a lot of economic forces on both sides, but it has a very good chance of passing. Why is it bipartisan? Why do Republicans and Democrats? Because the only thing that's bipartisan are things that help corporations.
Yes.
Okay, so number one, Vox is a giant corporation, and Vox's like companies are almost all backed up by hedge funds, private equity, venture capital, etc. Okay, less so hedge funds, but mainly the other two. But giant economic forces are on that side. Also, the local news is usually owned by enormous conglomerates, as Anna
like
pointed
Sinclair
out.
Media.
Exactly. What I was going to get to is that most of those for the local news companies are very conservative companies. So the Republicans are looking to rig the system while pretending to be in favor of the little guy and pretending to be in favor of news. They're actually rigging it in favor of Sinclair.
Yep.
So, and that doesn't mean that Facebook isn't conservative. Facebook seems to be putting their thumb on the scale for conservatives overall to begin with. That's my rough sense of it, very rough, okay? But these guys are even more conservative and they're fighting economically with one another.
Yes.
Okay, and guys, must-pass bills are a magnet for unpopular bills that corporations love, that politicians from both sides go, okay, this is the perfect time to rip off our voters. It's in a lame duck session when no one's paying attention. It'll look like it's part of a defense bill, which you can't vote against, right? And this is when we get to sneak in something that is deeply unpopular and deeply damaging because our donors asked us to. That's how this game is played. But since the media companies are also involved in this politically and have an economic stake in these news, you're almost never going to hear an honest news story about this.
You know how much digging I had to do today to really, first of all, to understand what this legislation really is? I mean, I had to go pretty far to figure out, I mean, like CNN, even Reuters, like they would mention like, yeah, there are some organizations like the ACLU that like happen to be against this, but they wouldn't explain why, right? Like you gotta go out of your way and figure out.
I had the same exact scenario.
Yeah, how come you guys aren't explaining the antitrust issues here? How come you're not explaining the massive issue with media conglomerates involved?
They would never explain
the investor class behind this, right? Like the private equity, the hedge funds, all of that. None of that is explained, of course. And what really disgusts me is the use of rhetoric that pertains to workers and their struggle, things like collective bargaining, and basically repurposing it to provide cover for crappy pro-corporate legislation.
There is no such thing as collective bargaining for companies. That's not a thing.
It's amazing.
They just made it up to make it look like corporate rule is actually populist and grassroots.
Right.
Oh, they're going for the little guy like Sinclair Broadcasting? That's absurd. All right, finally, what should be the standard? Look, these platforms don't owe us anything. So a lot of people love to cry. And so whether it's the right wing going, oh, I demand the right to be pro-Nazi and be on this platform, right? Or now giant mainstream media companies going, I demand the right to higher profits. Okay.
So crazy. Yeah.
No, the only thing that is fair is to ask the platforms like Facebook to be fair. So if you're gonna promote news, you're going to, or at least provide an outlet for, you're gonna provide links, you're gonna have an algorithm. The algorithm should be fair, and it should not judge whether you're a right winger or a left winger. It should just judge based on the content. I'm not positive every platform does that, and right wingers are totally lying about this, as always, with everything. Every platform that I've seen, with the exception of TikTok, that puts a thumb on the scale, puts a thumb on the scale in favor of conservatives, not against conservatives. So TikTok is much more stringent in what they ban, which then weeds out a lot of hateful right wingers. So that's why I say they're an exception. And I think YouTube is overall enormously fair, and that's you never hear that from anyone. But I think it's because they don't want to give credit to a giant company. But I think YouTube does it as fair as you can have it, right? And I've got a bias there too. We've been a partner with them for a long time. But if they weren't fair, I wouldn't tell you, okay? So anyway, bottom line is the Facebooks of the world should be left alone by other corporations with political meddling. They want to have a fight between companies, have at it, Hoss. That's called a free market, okay? If they want to rig it with the government, that should not happen. All Facebook owes anybody is fairness.